is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me.
Hello, I'm John Grom, and this is the 12th Right and Left Discussion Forum. Right and Left is a nonprofit company that was incorporated in Ohio in August of 2012 and is currently awaiting tax-exempt status from the IRS. Right and Left is a grassroots effort to promote civil discourse in politics. Our ultimate aim is to reduce the level of extreme partisanship that is crippling government at all levels. Our purpose is to work through the voters to tap into our collective wisdom that is too often absorbed in partisan conflict, and to bring clarity to those areas where we disagree. Organizationally, we are patterned after Mothers Against Drunk Driving. As such, we are establishing and fine-tuning a chapter in Wadsworth, Ohio, to use as a template for replication in chapters in other communities. Each chapter will have an active presence in its community with a speakers bureau, a local access TV program, visibility at local events, an aggressive advertising campaign, and a fundraising effort. Additionally, we will have an interactive website promoting civil discourse with an endorsable belief statement, a regular newsletter, and a capacity for the exchange and dissemination of ideas. We plan a multimedia advertising effort that will use the lion's share of our budget. Our discussion forum is aimed at demonstrating that reasonable people with different political views can have reasonable discussions about contentious topics, and we certainly hope that works today. Today's panel, beginning on my left, is Patty Haskins, a retired math teacher at Wadsworth High School and member of the Wadsworth City Council. On her left is Bryan Laubaugh, president of R&B Financial Consultants and member of the Medina County Republican Executive Committee. On his left is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist and dean of our panel. I call him that because he reminds me of Lawrence Spivak. He's the only one here old enough to know who Lawrence Spivak is. Our topic today is the complex issue of election regulations. Patty, as you know, the past few presidential election cycles have been characterized by controversial rulings regarding voting options and proof of voter ID. How would you describe the fairness of our current voting system?
Well, first of all, let me start by saying I think that voting is a privilege to be able to do in this country, and I believe it is our right, and it's one of the tenets of our society that makes this country the great country that it is, that we elect our officials. Do I think the voting system is fair? Yes. I think to maintain fairness, though, we have to make voting accessible for people. We have to make sure that there are not impediments placed in the line of people against voting. You know, for example, you know, in the past, women were not allowed to vote. In the past, there were literacy tests that had to be taken, poll taxes that were used in order to impede the right of citizens of this country from voting. I think we've taken great steps over the years to make the polls accessible for people. You know, at present, there's things that have been done recently as far as the extending the absentee voting, the early voting. In November's election, I know there was a great deal of discussion about the time for extended voting. Mr. Husted from the state had ruled that they were going, and I understand this. I think he had a good point in trying to make the times when voting could be held uniform across the state, so it was fair to everyone. And I think that was a good point. The problem was the limits that he were putting on were judged to be unfair in some counties, directed towards one particular party. And they did then allow the local election boards to go back to the original times that they wanted. It was interesting, our Medina County Board, which is the directors are Republican at this particular time, the head director is a Republican, were actually opposed to the time frame that he had set. and they put back. But those are the kinds of things I think we have done. I know I work with the polls myself. I just worked at our primary on Tuesday. And I don't think a lot of people know all of the interesting things we do to make voting accessible for people. For example, if someone pulls up in their car and they can't get out of the car to come in and vote, we are permitted, there is a procedure in place that we are permitted to take a ballot out to them. Now you have to have a member of both parties there and so forth so that it's legitimate. If you are blind, the machine is set up. There's at least one Braille machine basically in each that allows you to do it. So all of those things I think are making voting accessible and fair.
In a bit, I want to circle back to you, and we'll talk specifically about some of those times that voting is accessible. Bryan, I'm sure you've been thinking about this subject. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with Patty. I believe that voting is a privilege. It's our duty to participate, and it's also our duty to understand what the issues are that we're voting about. It's an obligation,
yeah.
And I think an educated voter, I'm not educated as far as being, college or anything. I think educated on the issues. They have a duty to express their opinions through their vote. I think there's been sort of an apathy that has settled over the country when it comes to voting and voting for their local elected officials. You see turnout a lot larger when there's a presidential election.
Oh, yeah.
I think more people need to be educated on the local issues that affect us directly. A president is important, and things that the president does affects us, but it doesn't really affect us directly. I agree with Patty that citizens should exercise their right to vote. I have trouble with individuals that aren't citizens that get the necessary identifications and they go to the polls. I don't think, we don't need any of that here. So I think if we use the rules and regulations that are in place, the procedures, everyone should have the privilege to vote, and we should maintain the integrity of the system that we have in place. And it's good people like Patty that volunteer, that go up and work the polls. You probably got there at 6:30 or 6 and
5:45.
5:45
Yes.
and work till 8:30 or 9.
Yes.
Making sure. So that takes a lot of effort. We need more people like that to be involved.
Well, Ron, sitting in for Lawrence Spivak today, I'm wondering, are you equally confident that our current system is fair?
Yes, I think it's fair. Several points raised here and several points in my mind. One is being informed. Now, I find that difficult to do because there's so much partisan politics, so much of the public media which is trying to pull you one way or the other. It's very difficult to get the wheat out of the chaff from all of that stuff. And even on the local level, I find in my day-to-day life, I'm not worrying too much about what the council's doing. Unless they decide to put an assessment on my property for fix my road, then I worry about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably true for a lot of folks. It's very hard to get involved for most folks, particularly people who have regular jobs, unlike retirees like me who just fritter their time away, to become informed about what's going on locally and informed what's going on nationally. I take a paper. I happen to be active on the internet and read a lot of stuff there. So maybe I'm more informed than some folks. I think that's a problem. It's a privilege to vote. I agree with that. I think we need to be an informed electorate. That's the difficult part, I think. How you get informed and how accurate your information is. Voter fraud. You alluded to that a little bit, Bryan. People who may not be residents or citizens of the particular area getting information enough to vote. I don't know if that's a big issue. The statistics that I looked at over the last national election indicate that was not a big deal. Perhaps in individual precincts, it may be. In individual places, it may be. I don't think, from what I had read, that it was a big issue here. That's one. I think one of the objections in Pennsylvania against voter ID. That's my, you're asking me to prove myself when I am a citizen of this country. It never occurred to me that that was an issue. Any place I've lived, I've needed ID of some sort to go vote. To prove that I needed to register, I moved to show that I was that person, and I don't see that that's a problem.
When you think about fraud, Bryan mentioned it, you did too. When you hear that 100 precincts in a metropolitan county have less than 1% of the vote for one candidate and over 99 for another, does that spell fraud to you?
Not necessarily.
You don't even get that in a communist country when there's only one candidate.
Particularly in our urban situations, John. And many precincts are primarily one race, one ethnic group. Some of those, in 100%, still, overall, from just an article this morning, what is today, May the 10th?
9th.
On the 9th, okay. See, I'm retired, I don't follow that stuff.
So is Kovack.
In a breakdown of from the census of the last presidential election, that really is only as much 66 or 70% of the maximum of eligible voters actually vote. And in some places, in some ethnic groups, it's down around 40–45%. So it's not surprising to me that you might get a preponderance one way or the other.
Yeah.
As far as the number of votes or the number of precincts voting, I don't know. I think it's plausible.
Let me ask this, Patty, I want to aim it at you. Working for the Board of Elections, and you're very, very familiar with the availability of opportunities to vote. But when you think about, we've got polling places that are open on the first Tuesday after the first Monday, and that they're open from 6:30 in the morning to 7:30 in the evening. In addition to that, starting 35 days before the election, you can apply for an absentee ballot. And when you get that, then you're able to mail it in or hand deliver it to the Board of Elections. In addition to that, anybody is able to walk in to the Board of Elections any day, 35 days before the polls close. Actually, you can walk in at 7:25 on election day and vote before the polls close. But you've got all that access. You can sit in your house, send an email or a phone call and get an application, have it sent to you, and you can get the ballot and you can put it in your mailbox, put up the flag, and the mailman will take care of everything else. How much easier can it get? Why do we need to have more in-person weekend voting and so forth? Why would you think that?
I think because they found, for example, for me, I will not do an absentee ballot, and the reason is I don't want to put my ballot in the mail. I know that sounds paranoid, but there are those of us that, for example, I do the early voting, in-person voting, because I'm going to be busy all day. I do not work at my precinct. So it does afford people those chances to do the early voting and avoid the long lines. I also worked last November in the presidential election, and it really wasn't too bad. I mean, all things considered, but we did have people waiting an hour in line to vote. I mean, it wasn't like the 8 hours or 6 hours we heard in other states. But there were many people that could not wait an hour. It was a very long time. Young mothers that had to get back to their children, this type of thing. And so what they were hoping to do by increasing that early in-person voting was to shorten the lines at the polls on election day. And I think that worked very satisfactorily.
Well, let me ask you this, or anybody who can respond to this question. I've not ever understood why some polling places are crowded and others are not. I don't know how they get allocated. But I know that when in the new place that I vote, in the 4th Ward, is in an area where there are 2 precincts.
Right.
There are tables side by side. And I walked in to vote, and my precinct was lined up out the door. The other precinct had nobody.
Right.
How does that happen?
Was that just this past Tuesday?
Yes. No. It was in November.
The past.
In November.
It depends upon I don't know, it's a number of different things on the, I think it's sometimes the makeup of the precinct. If it's a large, whether it's senior citizens or professionals or, working families, it can make a big difference when you walk in. If your precinct is primarily professionals, mom and dad both work, unless it's early in the morning or after work, they're not going to be busy during the day. If there's a high concentration of retired people, at 10 in the morning, you're going to see a great deal of activity in that precinct. It also may happen that there is a special, there could be a special vote in that one precinct as opposed to the other. Or I know, like the place that I work, it's 2 different wards and precincts that are there. So there might be a vote in the one ward where there isn't in the other ward. So that can account for some of it.
I think it's probably more significant about the working, non-working population. The only time I ever waited for about an hour and a half in line was when I lived in Connecticut on one of the presidential elections, when I had to go after work. And it was from 5 till about 6:30 till I got the vote. And there were just, huge numbers of people.
Yeah.
It was a very popular, significant election, so.
I've been voting since 1960, and in all sorts of situations, working, not working, retired, kind of retired, I've had all sorts of things, but I've never really had a problem voting. Last November, I had to wait in line probably for 45 minutes. That's the only time I ever waited in line. When I was going to work every morning, I'd go vote before I'd go to work, 6:30, 6:45, and usually I walked in and I had appointed the workers to just said hello, made sure everybody was there. But when I hear about people having to wait in line for 2 and 3 and 4 hours, I wonder what has gone wrong with the system, whereby we don't have greater resources applied to those areas. I mean, it's predictable. You know what the demographics of a ward or a county are.
One thing, I think people don't really pay much attention to what you just said a few minutes ago, that you can go to the Board of Elections 35 days before an election and cast your vote. This past November, I went to the Board of Elections because I was going to be doing some other things on Tuesday, and I think I stood in line 15 minutes. They got you in and out. So I think sometimes folks don't pay that much attention. Once again, back to the apathy. More people are concerned about who's going to win, the Voice TV show, or who's, what celebrity's doing this, than actually taking their right and their responsibility to vote seriously. So I don't believe we have a problem with accessibility. That we have enough people. There's enough equipment, the system is there, if people would just take advantage of it. I just can't imagine that within 35 days you can't find an hour to go to the Board of Elections. That's poor planning on your part when you show up that morning and it's a big election and you have to stand in line. How much more can you do? You can only do so much to help people, but people need to pay attention.
Yeah. But don't you find it's very difficult to find information sometimes about judgeships and who's
That's
running
the
for the
area that I
auditor?
think judges
Until the
are
last
very
week
difficult.
before the election.
Even when you're trying to find, the only thing there is partisan stuff.
Yeah.
And
Sometimes it's best to talk to an attorney that you know and find out what they think of the judges. They sometimes have a better grip on.
I've got a friend that lives down in Franklin County that manages to take the time to go visit all the candidates. Calls them on the phone and said,
really?
"I'd like to come to your house and talk to you."
Yeah.
No, yeah, it is. And we wind up voting alike. So why do I have to bother doing all that stuff? The problem, though, I think, with the having overcrowded polling places and these incredible lines and all, it's a solvable problem. When I hear about the discrimination at a polling place, and when you've got both Republican and Democrat workers there, plus sometimes an observer, how do these things happen?
I don't think that there are happening that much. And you also have your provisional, Ohio has provisional ballots that you can use.
Yes.
So if you have any question, the person doesn't have the right ID, you go through the provisional ballots, you're very clear, they have to fill all of this out, or it won't even be considered, and they're counted later. I remember in the November election, we had a gentleman walked in at the last minute. I mean, literally, it was because they could, as long as they're in line at 7:30, they can vote. And he walked in, it was like 7:28. Came up to our desk, and which had been the case all day because so many of the precincts were voting in new locations. He was in the wrong location.
Waited for an hour and well,
Well, he got right in, he came up,
Oh.
and we are supposed to send them to the correct location.
But it wasn't
He
time.
could not have made it to there. So he had to fill out a provisional with a note attached to it so that his vote wouldn't be lost. So again, this is the attempts by the election board to make every voter have the chance to vote. I agree totally, though. Voters have an obligation, I think, though, to become informed. Absolutely.
Which brings me around to one of my favorite topics. Should we be encouraging everybody to vote? It seems like it's almost a part of being an American, that it's a virtue to go vote whether you know what you're voting for or not, but to vote anyway. And that we've got a system that, for all practical purposes, is broken. We elect a Congress that has an approval rating in single digits. We elect all sorts of people that most people dislike. We're doing that as citizens. We're going out and creating this we're self-governed, and we're creating this situation that we all despise and is leading us in a terribly bad. We're unsustainable when it comes to national debt. And
John, maybe the apathy will save us on that. Because it's a self-limiting system, isn't it? If you're interested for whatever reason, whether it's enlightened self-interest or unenlightened self-interest, that's when you vote. If you're not interested at all, you don't vote. Whether you're informed or not. If you don't vote.
I think there's a stewardship that goes along with voting. And I would think that if we spent more time educating people as to why it's important and why they need to be involved, we'll get that educated voter. I struggle with the notion that some people shouldn't vote. I think everyone has the capacity to figure out what's going on and to vote how they feel. That's why we vote. So I guess I'm more to the liking of having more of a program to educate people on what the issues are and not get into. And I think that's what we're sitting here doing right now. We're having a discussion amongst ourselves from various political spectrums, and I don't see any hypersensitive, situations coming up where we're screaming at each other or anything. I think there's a good agreement.
I can see justification for online voting.
I'm sorry, Ron.
I can see justification for online voting, where there are secure ways of doing that, that you can vote. You should be able to do this online. I vote online for a number of things, like boards of directors of my college and that sort of thing, boards of trustees.
Isn't there a responsibility also, though, of the candidate to make sure that the public is informed? As someone who runs for office, that I have a responsibility to inform
I've known
voters.
my council representative for about 40 years now, and he hasn't been to my house for a long time.
Is that right?
I don't know. He doesn't come around and shake my hand when he's campaigning.
I sympathize with Brian's point of view that there should be a way to get objective information about issues and people. I've laid in bed at night and thought about, well, how are we going to do that, and who's going to do it, and how do we know that they're objective? Everybody thinks that they are. I mean, really, people on Fox News think they're fair and balanced, and the people on CBS think they're totally objective. In both cases, they're wrong. Now, and I'm making that judgment, so I get to be the guy then that decides what all this objective information is going to be. I don't know how you go about doing that. I just don't see how you can get unbiased, nonpartisan information out to people. It would be wonderful if you could. It really would be. I mean, you put together take your best effort to put together a totally objective committee or team to assemble information. Trust me.
It's never.
Well, you know, this is a good point, because the Beacon Journal had a group that came in, and they did just what we were talking about. There were a cross-section of people, and they interviewed the candidates, and they gave their opinions of who they thought were the better candidates.
When did this happen?
This happened back before the election,
Yes.
and they had a big spread in the Beacon Journal.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember what the name of the group was. Do you
Well,
remember?
it had some civility issue.
Yeah. It's like
It was
the
from
Jefferson
the-
Society or something like that. Don't
Something
quote
like
me on that, but it was.
Okay.
But they spent several weekends interviewing the candidates, and they came up with a very solid recommendation as far as not who to vote for, but who had a better understanding of the issues and all that kind of stuff. And what I took exception to was, after the Beacon Journal ran that spread, their editorial board basically went with everybody else other than what the Jefferson Committee had come up with. So, I think that,
Was that part of the Ray Bliss Institute at Akron U?
no. This was a totally different group of people.
I remember seeing it.
But
yes.
they had they spent a lot of time, and those are the types of things that I think should be encouraged.
Yes,
Well,
absolutely.
you know, all newspapers, I think, have a slant one way or the other.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
There used to be a program with Fred Friendly on, I can't remember what television network, but it was called The Advocates. And they did a wonderful job of approaching a lot of issues like that. You know. Well, thank you very much. This has been an interesting discussion, and thank you everybody for joining us today. To learn more about Right and Left, please visit our temporary website at rightandleft.org. Or to become a volunteer, or to contribute to Right and Left, or to comment on today's discussion, please contact me, John Grom, at 330-336-2213. We'd like to leave you with this thought from H.L. Mencken. Each party steals so many articles of faith from the other, and the candidates spend so much time making each other's speeches that by the time Election Day is passed, there's nothing much to do except turn the sitting rascals out and let the new gang in. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you join us next time for Right and Left Discussion Forum. Thank you.